Hey guys, if you don't know me, my name is Adrian. I am the founder of the Pageant project, and as often happens when I do pageant interviews, the subject of how I got into pageantry to begin with comes up. And especially, it's certainly, this video is not the first time me answering that question, but I understand that, if you didn't see the last time I answered this question 2 or 3 years ago, that's how long I've been in this game for. I'm not expecting you to dredge back through my social media to find the answer. And I think also the answer evolves over time, not because I'm changing, my version of the truth, but just because I have more time to think about it, put it into more context. Obviously, as the years go by, I've been doing this about 8 years, I think, and by this I mean interviewing pageant girls. And as you interview more, things evolve, things change, you change, which is a good thing. The pageant project itself, I started back in 2018, but that was really the genesis of when I decided, okay, I'm going to try and do something specifically in the pageant space. Whereas probably for 2 years before that, so going back to 2016, I had started interviewing people, but it just wasn't specifically in the pageant space. Although, as it would turn out, pretty much the first person I interviewed was, or maybe not the first, but one of the first two. It's a long time ago, okay? But certainly one of the earliest interviews was with a pageant contestant. And so that was my. And look, I'll give you a bit more context as well. So for those of you, because I've answered the question of how I got into pageantry to begin with, and I will do that again if you're new around here. Um, but I haven't really given context as to what happened before pageantry because I did have a life before pageantry, contrary to popular belief. And so, if you don't know, I'm sitting here in my backyard in Sydney, Australia. I've lived in Sydney pretty much all my life. I did have a stint up on the Gold Coast, and I kind of took Australia for granted a bit, I would say, up until COVID. And then when COVID hit, I had never been more thankful to get back to Australia. Number one, because I was in UK at the time when it really hit. So I got back home to Australia, and so number two, I've never been more. Also, I got diagnosed with ADHD recently, so sometimes my stories wind a bit. So I can't even remember if I said number one, number two, but I took Australia for granted a bit. But COVID really changed that because I saw the way that the world, some of the world anyway, mishandled COVID. And at that time, and that's when I realized I actually really love Australia. It's kind of sane over here, kind of sane, not insane, sane. And sometimes when I look at world news, although I try my best to avoid that, particularly around US election season, um, it doesn't instill me with a great feeling. And I certainly hope sanity prevails sooner rather than later. But Sydney, Australia, born and raised. My parents one comes from Hong Kong, one comes from China. I mean, Hong Kong belongs to China now, but back in those days, Hong Kong belonged to the British, so that's why I bring that up. And then school, obviously, here in Sydney. I was very academic growing up. Uh, I wouldn't say I'm still academic now because I really don't like formal study because I believe very often it's lagging behind, it's not practical and it's lagging behind what you actually need. And I think that's only become more evident recently with the advent of things like AI. But I was academic. I'm still, put it this way, I came first in year three in my school, year four, and year six. In year five, this is when you look back at it through the lens of someone who's been diagnosed with ADHD, it makes sense. Year five, I got so bored of coming first so easily. And I know that sounds very egotistical, but being honest, year five, I got so bored of coming first easily without really having to try that I basically just winged it. And I said, I don't want to come first. I didn't say that because coming from an Asian family, if you said that, you'd be, you know. Um, but I remember making that decision in my mind, like, this is too easy. I can't be bothered. And then I remember in year five when it was announced that I had come second. that was me not trying was coming second. And I remember distinctly in the classroom, several of my classmates turning around to look at me, shocked and surprised that I hadn't come first, which is quite something when your classmates at that age just expect you to come first at everything. And that actually got me really, really annoyed. I remember kind of angry. And I was like, you know what? I'm not letting this other person, I'm not letting anyone else come first because they don't deserve it. They're not as smart as me. So then in year six, I tried again and came first. But that was primary school. So here in Australia, that's up to about the age of 12. And one of the reasons I wanted to go through my story again is because I know there's a lot of new faces around here and predominantly from America. So, hello. Um, so I'm giving context in case you don't, in case our schooling systems are different. And then high school, so years 7 to 12, or from the ages of 13 to 18, we don't use terms like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior here. I had to look up what those meant when I was interviewing American girls, and they would say, "Oh, I had, my freshman year." I'm like, "What's a freshman?" I've heard it in Hollywood movies, but I had no idea what it was. We don't use those terms here. But it was interesting because my primary school up until I came first in year six, it was quite near to here the school, and you can see the background here, very lovely, a lot of open space. And then year seven was the same school, but the high school version of it, which was in the city, concrete jungle. I immediately hated it. I had to travel into school on the train every day, and I've just never liked concrete jungles. I think they all look the same. I don't like hustle and bustle. I don't like being, lining up for a coffee or lining up for the train and being shoulder to shoulder with people, even more so after COVID, right? Um, and I didn't enjoy that at all. And also, our high school was much bigger than our primary school, probably three times the size. And so suddenly I was having to try harder and I wasn't coming first anymore. And again, if you know anything about ADHD, that's a big issue. It's quite a common issue, actually. When you have to start trying to do something that came so easily to you before, and you're actually getting less result, not more result, it makes it, let's say, difficult. And in year seven, I actually was almost expelled, which is unheard of for me because I'm generally a very well behaved person. Again, coming from an Asian family. And I was almost expelled because I truanted from school. I didn't go to school when I should have. And here, at least at that time, in that school, that was a very serious offense. I've heard from other schools in other countries, if you waive school, you wag school, it's like it's not a big deal. It was for me. And I almost got expelled. And as part of the Inquisition, so to speak, I was taken to a psychiatrist. And I remember being diagnosed. I remember the psychiatrist drew me a Venn diagram. I don't remember why. I just remember I had this diagram up near my bed for the longest time. But the psychiatrist basically said, "Oh, you know what your problem is? You're too intelligent, so you are bored easily." And I was like, "Really? Well, wow, that's just huge." And I'm being sarcastic. Like, I didn't need a psychiatrist to tell me that. But anyway, I say all that to say I have an academic background. I like to think I'm still intelligent, probably too much so sometimes. And I then, after I finished to put it this way, I finished high school, so age of 18 or year 12, and I got 99.55 in the higher school certificate, or the leaving exam, put it that way, for high school. And 99.55, what does that mean? Well, it's a percentage. So if you get 99.55, you're in the top one half, even less than, you're in the top 0.45 of a percent of everyone in Australia. And so, to give you some context, um, that is my academic background. I had the marks to do anything I wanted coming out of that because that mark is, in Australia at least, determines what you're allowed to study in university or college. There's an entrance mark, and so for medicine or law, which were the two highest ones at the time, I think vet and dentistry might have been up there as well. But the entrance mark for medicine could be in the 99s. As in, if you got 98, you couldn't get into a medicine degree. There might be other ways around it, like do a different undergrad and then go into postgrad, but you couldn't get into it directly. Getting 99.55, I had the choice of any degree I wanted. And I come from a family of doctors, mother a doctor, father a doctor, my brother, younger brother, is now a doctor as well. but I didn't want to. It's just the rebel in me. It's like everyone else is a doctor. I'm not. I'm going to do anything apart from being a doctor. And so, again, this is probably where the ADHD came in. I was fascinated by planes, specifically military planes, specifically American military planes. Back then, F 14s, F 15s, F 16s, F 18s. Now, they're antiquated. But I was like, oh, I like planes. I want to fly one day. I know, I'll study aeronautical engineering or aerospace engineering, which were basically different names for the same degree. I went into a double degree of aeronautical engineering and science. I was going to do computer science. And I only mentioned this because that had an entrance mark. Remember, I got 99.55. That had an entrance mark like in the 60s, I think. So I, I got this 99.55, and here I was going into a degree that required like 30 points less, thereabouts. Um, and so, university was university. I don't think it's hugely important, suffice to say, except to say I really didn't enjoy it. Uh, it University for me had no boundaries, and you didn't need to show up, and they didn't care. Some of the lecturers literally really didn't care. They weren't doing teaching, so they could do their own research projects in the background. So I didn't enjoy uni. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Don't get me wrong, I value education. I just don't do well in that sort of environment. If I'm someone, again, could be ADHD, could be just people in general, but if I'm interested in something, I'll teach it to myself and I'll teach it to me faster than any teacher could teach it. If I'm not interested, it just bounces, goes in one ear, comes out the other. And so, all of that to say, I had an academic background. I started violin at the age of 2, Suzuki method again. I've interviewed a couple of people in the US who have told me they also did Suzuki method. I did violin. Um, Again, coming from an Asian family, academic music comes probably second. Sport was nowhere to be seen. Uh, and then coming out of university, I got into my first job in IT. That lasted about a year and a half until I had a disagreement with a manager who was a moron. Let's just put it that way. If you ever get into 9 to 5 and if you haven't seen it's an Australian series called Utopia, it should be called Dystopia. It's really funny, but my theory of in a lot of companies anyway, 9 to 5 companies, like how you get into management is basically by being useless. Because if you actually have a valuable skill, you're too valuable. Let's say in IT, for example, they need you there. But if you're not really good at IT, or where we can put you, where can we put you? Oh, we can put you into management. Because what skill do you really need to be in managerial positions? Oh, you need people skills. Like, yeah, okay. So my manager was a bit of a twit. His manager was even more of a twit. It was like the further up you go, the fewer IQ you have. Now, I know some of you might be offended by that, and you work in managerial positions and you're super intelligent. Kudos to you. It's just my experience and my belief, okay? I'm not saying it applies to everyone. But when that job evaporated, I was like, oh, well, I want to go back to study because, I don't want to go back into IT. I want to try something different. And again, might be the ADHD thing. I decided I was going to represent musicians, artists. I wanted to, find the next Taylor Swift sort of thing. And so I went into JMC Academy, which was interesting because I then interviewed a pageant, an Australian pageant queen many years later, and she actually worked at this academy. So it was quite an interesting thing to have in common. But I studied music business management at JMC Academy in the middle of the city. And I really enjoyed that because it was something that I was interested in, but also the teacher was he was old school rock and roll. Put it this way, the first day he turned up to teach, they told him that he wasn't dressed professionally enough. And they told him like he needed to wear a collared shirt and jeans at the very least. And so, being the rebel that he was, he then bought like 5 of the exact same collared shirts, 5 pairs of jeans, and the same jacket, and he wore that every day, just as a giant middle finger to the people who told him he hadn't dressed professionally enough. He had long hair down to his shoulders, and he was a great guy. He taught by experience, he taught by analogy, he taught by story, and I really enjoyed that. Not to say I really did anything with the music business management degree. I did learn a bit about contract law, which would come in handy later on, advising some pageant queens looking at their contracts. But I went into that, and here in Australia, at least, the undergrad you can take out a student loan, and it's not that much, not compared to the US anyway. But postgrad degrees is where they get you, and so I needed to fund that, and I was like, well, I just got let go from my job, so what am I going to do? And I had played a bit of tennis growing up. It was like the only sport that I really got to play. I played it once a week with my dad and his friends, and I really liked it. I didn't get to play it much because, again, Asian background. So I thought, you know what? I had just taken an adult tennis camp. I don't remember why. I just thought, oh, something different. I like tennis. Let's see what happens. Take a bit of tuition because I never had tennis lessons growing up. Well, I had one or two. I don't remember anything they taught me. And I thought, maybe I can be a tennis coach. Because prior to that, all my paying jobs had been sort of coaching or tuition. My very first job was as a tutor. And then even my job in IT, it was, yes, I was doing database work, things like SQL, website design. But a lot of what I most enjoyed doing was helping people with their computers and their IT problems. And so it was always sort of, I've always taught people, I've always coached people, and I still do to this day. But I ended up doing tennis coaching. Long story short, for probably the next 10 years after that, I ended up becoming the head coach at a girls' school near me, an all girls school near me. And so, all that to say, I think that's pretty much a background you need because that then leads us to pageantry. But I guess a bit of personal background. I mean, obviously, you can see I was academic. Typical pretty strict Asian upbringing, and so I was pretty shy, introverted. So meeting girls was a problem, especially going to an all boys school. Had no idea what to do around girls. Just didn't see any of them. I went to my year 12 formal by myself. I just went with my friends. I didn't have a date to go with. I didn't know any girls to ask. Looking back at it now, it's funny. It's not really embarrassing anymore. It's too long ago, but I kind of feel sorry for my younger self. Um, but being sort of hyper intelligent and being hyper self aware, and then sort of being a bit sheltered as well. I certainly, before I got to pageantry, I went through my share of challenges. I had a younger sister, so my younger brother and younger sister were twins. She passed away very suddenly in her early 20s, very unexpectedly. That was hard. My tennis coaching business basically was stolen from me by someone who was jealous and petty again in management. Um, that was a very difficult time to go through because it was a bit of a scandal at the school. He was saying things about me that weren't true, and it was a whole legal case. I had a falling out with my former boss, who I thought was a really good friend. He sided with the money against me, and so I've had a couple of very bad mental health issues a long time ago. I would say they're as much as they can be. They're behind me now, but I have been suicidal twice, and I even wrote a book about mental health, which became a bestseller on Amazon. And so all this is I didn't have a straight line path. Obviously, no one gets into pageantry, at least as a guy doing what I do. There's no like, oh, I'm going to study pageant interviewing at university. So to get where I am today talking to you, it's been a very circuitous path. It's been connect the dots, if you will. And I think that's the main part of it. So I've told you, academically gifted, musically learned the violin since I was two. Like I haven't done it, consistently for many, many years, but I did start it very young. Then ended up, got the marks to become a doctor, ended up as a tennis coach. But I learned how to run my own business, had significant business problems, mental health issues, and what led me to pageantry eventually was actually the tennis coaching because, as I said, I was working at an all girls school and I had become the head coach there. And remember that I have had always been teaching people, I'd always coached people, and that a lot of people say they love helping people, and that's very much me. And I remember, and I've told this part of the story quite often, I was coaching. It was a group session, I think, and I just saw one of the girls, and she had these parallel cuts on her arm. And at that stage, mental health awareness, self harm awareness in Australia was very much in its infancy, and I didn't really know what those were. I just thought, oh, maybe it's just a discoloration on the skin, or maybe she fell over and cut herself off her skateboard or something. Turns out she had been ritualistically, is that a word? Ritualistically harming herself. And that really got me thinking. I'm a problem solver as well. As much as I like helping people, when you present me a problem, my brain goes into automatic mode of how can I help solve this problem? And so obviously a young woman cutting herself, that's a huge problem. And so my brain went into problem solving mode. Not only how can I help her, but how can I help people like her? And not only that, but how can I make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen? So preventative rather than reacting to it after the fact. And I'm sure many of you know now, like mental health, the best thing we can do is get in front of it before it becomes a problem. Once it becomes a problem, it's a lot harder and more expensive, frankly, to deal with. And when someone's considering self-harm or even worse, very often the first time they try something drastic, and we've had episodes of of that in the pageant world with people like Chesley Christ. The first time they take, although actually I read her biography and that wasn't the first time she had tried to you know do something to herself to end her own life. But very often the first time they try something, when you're in a mental health crisis, there's no coming back from it because that's game over. And so my whole thinking was not only what can I do about this, but how can I help make sure it doesn't happen, or the chances of it happening are drastically reduced. And I remember thinking, well, I've always loved interviewing. Um, one thing I forgot to mention, I'm a certified life coach, and I learn under a guy named Tony Robbins, who's a probably the world's preeminent life coach. And I was fascinated by how he could take someone from the audience who was suicidal, or a couple that was yelling at each other, hating each other, and he could turn them around in one conversation, and on a lasting basis. He could make a lasting difference to them, like turn a suicidal person around in one conversation. And the conversation might have been an hour, but still, it's one conversation versus going to see a therapist and nothing changes for 10 years. And I became fascinated by that because problem solver and wanting to help. And so I learned under him, learned a lot of his tools, and really, really enjoyed that. But he had always been an advocate of getting around people that you could pick their brains, and rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, find someone who had done what you wanted to do and go interview them, buy them a dinner or whatever and talk to them. So I thought, I'm going to interview young women, not celebrities, but I'm going to interview young women, real people who are, as in real women, not some fake celebrity out there. You have no idea what they really are like, but role models basically. And if I can interview role models and get these young women to watch interviews with people who are really achieving, women who are achieving great things, then that by itself should be preventative or curative in some way, because they can see other people who have been through, let's say, a hard time and have overcome it and gone on to achieve great things. So that was a genesis of the interviewing. So that was, I give you that because I've not, I think it's important to give some context into who I am personally, because I don't think I've really done that before, because the story, I'm looking at the timer here, it's almost half an hour, and I haven't even really got to pageantry yet, although we're there now. But I don't normally talk a lot about myself in interviews because I consider that bad form, because I should be letting the other person talk, basically. I should be letting the interviewee talk, not talk over, not use an interview to talk about myself. I see interviewers doing that and it drives me absolutely crazy. But so I had decided that I would start interviewing. In those days, it wasn't going to be online interviewing, live interviews anyway. The technology wasn't there yet, really, at all. And so I got and again, I've joked with my ADHD friend, Eliza. She's like my ADHD mentor. Although she's younger than me, she's got a lot more experience with ADHD. And we joke that when you got ADHD and you take up a hobby, there's no such thing really. It's like you go full into it. So I ended up getting a 3 camera setup, three, four like large softbox lights, and it was funny because I was sure that I needed 3 cameras. I needed one close on me, one close on the interviewee, and one wide shot. And I didn't have a studio. I still don't to these days. You don't really need one when you can interview just virtually. But I didn't have a studio. So one of the first interviews I did was with a personal trainer, a local personal trainer. I ended up interviewing her in a local park and lugging around, 3 cameras, 3 tripods, audio equipment. I didn't need lights because it was outside. We sat on a park bench, and I can look back at that interview now and it's like, oh god, like probably better than most people would be on their first interview, but so bad, so so awkward. I mean, I should give myself some credit. It's probably better than what 95% of people could do, but still, after having done hundreds, like over 300 interviews later, obviously I like to think I've gotten better than I was back then on interview number one. But that was the genesis of the interviewing. And so it started in person. And as I said, like one of the first people I interviewed, Tasha, the girl I interviewed, the woman I should say I interviewed before her, Monique, she had competed in pageantry and it came up, but we didn't really discuss it more. That wasn't the focus of the interview. But the interview I did with Tasha Ross, pageantry very much was the focus of the interview. And I can look back at that, and this probably was the most excruciatingly embarrassing interview because I knew nothing about pageantry. Now, if you're watching this and you're in the United States, particularly in the southern, you're in the South, you guys, and I'm planning on going to the South. I'm planning on going to Tennessee in June 2025 for Miss Volunteer America. One of the reasons I want to do that is to experience the pageant culture that's there, because pageantry, you got to understand, it's ingrained in you, but in Australia, it's not. I had never heard about beauty pageants. I didn't know toddlers and tiaras was a thing. I think I had heard about Miss Congeniality, but I was like, why would I want to watch this? I think I did watch it, but it was just as a comedy, not because I hadn't knew anything about pageantry. And so I remember my even back then I had my same final 10 questions, except for one difference, and it was question 7, which now is about superpowers. Back then, the 7th question when it was, "What is your favorite curse word?" And I didn't come up with those 10 questions, by the way. Came up with, I think it was a French interviewer who came up with a list of 10. He wanted to come up with a list of 10 questions that could tell you a lot about a person, very like a list of very deceptively simple questions, but the answer would tell you a lot about the person. And so I just used those as a neat way of closing the interview. But the 7th question that he had was, "What's your favorite curse word?" And obviously, pageantry, I didn't know in those days you're not allowed to curse. And so she wouldn't slash couldn't answer the question. I couldn't understand why. And I remember because I was interviewing her just up there in my house, and the interview went well enough. And that's when I kind of caught the pageant bug, so to speak. But I remember having a photo with her afterwards because, hey, pageant girls love taking photos. I didn't know this. I hated being in front of the camera. I'm much more comfortable with it now. But I was like, oh, what, you want me to pose with this? And Tasha is 5'9", blonde, absolutely gorgeous. And as I said, me, awkward, introverted, had no idea what to do with girls. And so there's a photo of me standing with her in my front garden. I think it was taken by her mother because her mother came along. And normally when you take a photo with a pageant girl, you're standing at an angle, you put your arm around them. I don't like to actually touch them. I do like the whole hover hands thing, something that Will Smith talked about. It was like you put your arm behind them, but you don't actually touch them because you can't tell from the front that you're not touching them. It looks like you got your arm around them. By the way, there are lots of creepy guys who take out like really creepy photos with girls, like full on hugging. No, don't do that. That gives me the heebie-jeebies. Um, but I didn't know to do that. I had no idea that pageant girls have favorite sites to take photos and posing and all that. So I'm literally there. She's blonde, 5'9", and gorgeous, smiling, and I'm there, ramrod stiff. I'm literally standing like a toy soldier with my hands by my sides, not smiling because I didn't know what to do. I'll see if I can find it. I'll make it the thumbnail of this video. It's the most embarrassing photo. But that's where I caught the pageant bug. Because what happened was Tasha told me about a fundraiser she was doing because she lives in the same city as I do in Sydney, and so I thought, oh, okay, I enjoyed the interview. I was curious, so I went to the fundraiser. I still remember I ended up entering the raffle and I won a mountain bike prize in the raffle. But I was so her fundraiser was like 50 minutes away by car, and the bike was so big it wasn't going to fit in my car, and so I won that mountain bike, and I just said to Tasha, "Look, yeah, I won it, but I can't take it, so give it to someone else." I still remember that, but I went to a fundraiser. And if you're watching this, you probably know what pageant fundraisers are like. You meet a whole bunch of other pageant girls, and pageant girls, one thing they're very good at, most of the time anyway, is working the room. So even though I was shy, awkward, not going to say boo to a mouse, I ended up at a table with a couple of pageant girls. One of them asked me, "What do I do?" or "How do you know Tasha?" and interview Tasha, blah 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 blah. And so, and back in those days, people who interviewed pageant girls was a very rare thing. Nowadays, there's a lot of people who do it, and most of them are absolute trash, I will say. I'm sorry. I know that's very judgmental of me, but I look at them, they don't know how to ask questions properly. They don't follow the flow of the conversation at all. They keep talking about themselves. They don't do research. They try to make it too serious. And I take my interviewing, I'm not going to say seriously, but I have interviewer role models, people who I looked up to, and I studied how they interviewed and went, oh, okay, most of them don't have a list of prepared questions. Actually have to follow the flow of the conversation and adjust on the fly. And, most pageant interviewers just can't do that. They lack the confidence and maybe the skill. But back in those days, there were a couple of people who were doing pageant interviews, and I kind of think they were actually better than most of the ones that are around now. I think most of them have long since stopped doing it. I think I've outlasted pretty much all of them. But word started getting around, and so one pageant interview leads to another, leads to another. I joked that I was like the coronavirus, but in a good way. I was contagious. And at some point, we transitioned into live interviews being feasible. The technology started to come out, and so I was like, oh, okay, I can start interviewing people who don't, let's say, don't live in Sydney. They could live in another city in Australia. In fact, they could live overseas. And so I remember Savannah Miles, who, if you don't know, is I just interviewed her again recently, which is kind of cool because we were joking about how the first interview was like 7 years ago, and at the time she was Miss Georgia Teen USA. Was it 2018? I want to say 2018. And when I interviewed her, I think she was staying in a hotel room with her mum in New York, and that was one of my first international pageant interviews. And I got really excited by that because even back then I could tell Savannah's ability to interview was so much further ahead of most of the Australian girls. Again, because the culture in the South is from Georgia. She was the culture in the South is so many girls into pageantry, and so you have to get good at speaking and interviewing and selling yourself. And I was blown away by that. I can still remember being amazed by how well I think at the time she was 17, 18, how well a 17 or 18-year-old could speak, because I coached 17 or 18-year-old girls here in Australia, like for tennis, and they couldn't speak. They could speak English, but no, every second word was or like. And so live interviews began to become a thing. And what happened was that my pageant journey has really gone in three stages. One was what I've already told you, so the in-person stuff, and that started in Australia. And at that point, really, I was only interviewing Australian girls. When the live technology started to be feasible, the next phase really was in the UK. This was stage 2 of 3. And this happened because here in Australia, at least, the Galaxy pageant is one of the bigger pageants in America, and internationally it's probably quite small, but here in Australia it's one of the bigger ones because, again, we don't have a pageant culture. And so even being a small pageant by international standards means you're very big here in Australia. They probably had 30 or so contestants. I don't know. It was so far back then. So far back, I can't remember. But 30, put it this way, 20 contestants in this day and age here in Australia would make you a fairly big Australian pageant. Kind of be laughable, I think, in other countries like the US or Philippines, certainly. But I interviewed the CEO of Galaxy Pageants because I was looking at, well, how can I grow my brand? Not necessarily my business, because I wasn't making money off of these. I mean, interviews, you don't make money unless you get a certain number of views, let's say on YouTube through AdSense or something. But I was like, okay, well, if I interview, and it's my strategic / ADHD brain kicking in again, if I interview a director, then that's going to get in front of a lot of the girls, and then a lot of the girls will want to interview, and so I won't have to go around chasing up individual people to interview, because at that time I was spending a lot of time asking people for interviews, and you know what it's like, back and forth, and it just takes a lot of time. So I thought, well, this will be fast. I'll interview the director, then I'll ask the director to forward on a message to her contestants. If anyone wants to interview, get in contact with me. She did that, and I ended up, I think, doing about 10, maybe 10 interviews in the space of a week, maybe even more, all live interviews, all overseas, and a lot of them were in the UK. A lot of the UK girls jumped at the experience. The Galaxy pageant is unusual because the international is held in America, but there aren't many American girls in it. The biggest contingents to Galaxy are from Australia, the UK, and Canada. So it's a bit weird. So that's why I didn't end up interviewing many American girls at that point, even though the pageant is American technically, and the director certainly is in America. She lives in Texas. So, and in those days again, so there really wasn't a lot of people doing pageant interviews, and I like doing them well. So I got, I did the setup as best I could. I took my influence actually from gaming. I saw some gaming podcasts, and I really liked the way they were done. So I based my interview production values on that. That's kind of why, even if you look at to it to this day, my interviews, I like to think, still look better than anyone else's, because I put in the effort to find out what the best way to do them is, hardware and software. There's a plane overhead, if you can hear that, apologies. But I kind of blew up in the UK because of the whole Galaxy thing. And so, and I say this because I look at my Instagram following quite often, and you can see, where the followers are, like which country. And of course, initially it was predominantly Australia, because I was only interviewing Aussie girls. And then I looked at one stage, and it's like more than, I think it was almost half of my followers had suddenly come from the UK. And I was like, oh, that's great. And this was just before COVID hit, so probably 2019. And I ended up growing so much of a following, and ended up networking with, and I started a podcast because I was going through. I started a podcast with UK co-hosts, not Australian co-hosts. I tried in Australia. I did try an Australian podcast at the same time, but it died a death. No one was really that interested in it. But the UK girls were hungry for interviews and appearance opportunities, so I started a UK podcast. Built quite a lot of notoriety in the UK, so much so that I ended up going to UK for the UK Galaxy pageants just before COVID hit. Um, and so that was kind of stage two. And then COVID hit. Now, during COVID, I actually probably grew even more during COVID, because my stuff was all remote, and so I could interview anyone from around the world. And obviously, when the world shut down, you couldn't really do appearances. And again, being a problem solver, I saw a lot of people were struggling at home, because you're locked in, you couldn't go anywhere. And so I did some different things that were a bit out of the box. I did a game night where girls, I got 8 queens on from different systems, and I got them all to represent their system, and we played these silly games. If you know Jackbox, I think it's called the Jackbox Party Pack, um, and you can actually broadcast this live, and then viewers can tune in on their mobile device, put in a room code, and they can play along. And so I remember during COVID actually getting big live streams on, because I'd have these 8 UK queens representing their systems. At one stage, we did them representing their different countries, so the UK being England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And we got them representing their country, so that was a big thing, and we had lots of people tuning in from home. And also at that time, so it would have been 2020, I released my first pageant book. It was in 2 volumes, Confessions of a Pageant Queen. They went on to both be in the top 10 on Amazon, and I didn't write it. I put out a thing on Instagram and Facebook saying, hey, I want to help spread some, good spirit around, because COVID, everyone was struggling. So I thought I'll put together a book that highlights pageant girl stories. So I put out a post. Thought I might get 20, 30 responses, because what you had to do was I put like 10 questions together. You could go to the download the template, type in your answers, submit a headshot, and then I will put you in the book. And I got over 100 responses. I think I got 160 somewhere north of that. I mean, there were so many responses I couldn't fit it into one volume. That's why there had to be two volumes, A to K and L to Z, like the old school phone books, because I couldn't. I don't know how much you know about publishing, but Amazon Publishing, the biggest book size you can have is 800 pages, and so we had 1,600 pages to give you an idea. But that was during 2020. So I also become a best-selling author for the second time. Well, top 10. My mental health book, which I mentioned before, had got number one. And that was during COVID. During COVID was really also the first time when I got a real experience with, let's say, the less desirable aspects of pageantry, because I had become well known in the UK, in the pageant industry. There were other people who were quite jealous of that, specifically other pageant interviewers or businesses, brands, and they'd be nice to your face. And I was never one to shun anyone. I would invite these people on as podcast guests and things like that, because I feel like was the rising tide lifts all boats sorts of thing. And then I remember at one stage, because Grand, good old Miss Grand, always one where there's the most drama. During COVID, they wanted to go ahead in Venezuela. Now, I don't know how you feel about Venezuela. I don't know much about Venezuela, but at that time, it was at the peak of COVID. You were only supposed to be leaving home, certainly leaving the country, if it was like a necessity. Pageantry wasn't a necessity, so that was my first problem. Okay. Number two, the political situation in Venezuela was so bad that the UK didn't even have an embassy in Venezuela. So, and it was on basically a no-fly list. It was like, because I looked this up, the UK government said, don't fly to Venezuela unless it's absolutely necessary, basically life or death, and understand that if something happens to you in Venezuela, we probably can't help you. Also, there were situations where the Venezuelans, I don't know exactly who it was, I won't say the Venezuelans, but there was a bunch of Americans who were taken hostage, like businesses, not pageant girls, but I think it was a bunch of American businessmen were taken hostage and ransomed off for money. This wasn't exactly the best place to send a bunch of young pageant women to by any stretch of the imagination. So again, peak of COVID, shouldn't be traveling. It's on a no-fly list, and it's not. Anyway, I said as much, and because what had happened was the directorship of Grand UK had just changed over. The former director had been let go. She's actually still the director of UK Galaxy, um, but she had had some sort of falling out with the system. I can't remember the exact details, and so a new director had come on board. They hadn't disclosed who they were at all. And so I was concerned that if you're a new director and you don't really know what you're doing, you're still learning the ropes, and you're going to send girls into basically a no-fly zone during the peak of the pandemic, I was concerned because I didn't say it was a bad idea. I said I just hope that this director knows what they're doing, and I think they should disclose who they are publicly so we can just make sure that the girls are going to be safe. Anyway, I did this as a live without really thinking about it too much. I just wanted to say my piece and said, okay, no problem if you've basically looked at everything that I've looked at and you've gone, okay, we're going to do this anyway, and you've made the girls that you're sending aware of the situation, because very often girls will just fly to a country they're excited to represent their country, and then they find out when they're there that not everything is as it seems. Anyway, this video kind of blew up, and it wasn't because of me. It was because some well-meaning acquaintances of mine, because I said I'd built up a fair bit of notoriety, they took it that step further and started, insisting that this director disclose who she was, and basically they said a bit too much and took my message completely out of context and started being a bit bullying. Let's put it, to be a bit of a bully. But it wasn't me, because I've looked back at that video many, many times, and I was as even-handed as can be. I was very explicit, saying I was saying I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just saying we should be aware and we should make sure that the girls are safe. That's the number one thing. I've always said that. And so a couple of other people in the pageant space in the UK decided to take aim at me and said I was being a bully, blah, 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 blah. And it was ridiculous because I'm always someone who tries to do the right thing. And so I didn't take it very well. And, being called a bully, that no one is going to call me bully. If you know me, that would be the last adjective you'd ever use to describe me. But that was a pretty bleak time because one of the pageant brands even started basically a campaign that was explicitly targeting me for being a bully, and they were just. I feel like it was the beginning of wokeness, but not in a good way, but a bad way. Like, it's like, oh, we're going to, stand against the darkness, and the darkness apparently was me. And I was like, what are you talking about? It's a peak of the pandemic. You're sending the girls into a war zone there's no embassy. What's the darkness? I'm just spitting facts here. But that was the first time I really sort of copped badly the darker side of pageantry. And all this to say, over the 8 years that I've been doing this, one of the reasons that a lot of girls will come to me for coaching is not necessarily because I'm an expert, but because I say it as it is, and they know I've had all kinds of experiences. I've seen absolutely everything in pageantry by this stage. I mean, 2020 in the UK was really the beginning of it when I was targeted by that anti-bullying campaign. And when you're locked at home and you're the target of a bullying campaign, and you see some friends abandon you, and you see some other people, literally take aim at you, it's not a good thing to happen. And then after that, uh, I began to see I had more and more people come out of the woodwork to tell me about similar problems that they've had. Problems with systems, problems with bad NDAs, bad contracts. A lot of them in foreign countries. One particularly in South Africa, not in South Africa, in Africa. Uh, that still exists to this day, and I've seen contracts and things like that. I've been involved in legal disputes, but 2020 really was the beginning of what I like to say. I had the naive blinders removed, like the rose-colored glasses. They were gone by the end of 2020. But that was kind of stage two. It was okay. Stage one was Australia in person. Stage two, we could start to do live interviews, and I blew up in the UK. Stage three was kind of figuring out what to do after that, and that's kind of still. I tried a couple of things, and none of them really took. So my response, again, being the problem solver, when the whole anti-bullying thing came out against me, I thought what I should do is create a pageant review site similar to a TripAdvisor, and we did a fundraiser for it. A lot of people donated. I think we raised probably, I mean, not a huge amount, but not nothing. £5 or £600 maybe, because it's in the UK. And the idea was to create a pageant review site where people could be honest about their experiences with pageants, and so that would help aid transparency in the industry, which is still something to this day. I would say we probably need it even more now than we did back then. And we tried a couple of things, tried a few different pieces of software, but as with many of the things that I tried in pageantry, what I didn't realize, what I failed to take into account, was that the girls are not going to be honest if they can't be anonymous, because you get blacklisted in pageantry, as I think you all will be well aware of. In pageantry, there's a big stigma. If you come out and say something negative, even if it's true, you can be blacklisted, and it can make it much harder for you to compete again. And I don't agree with that at all. I think that's terrible, but it's kind of the way the industry is. And so I didn't take that into account. And also, vice versa. If I let people review anonymously, then a whole bunch of people could just leave negative reviews anonymously. That wouldn't be fair to the director. And then on the other hand, and I was seeing this in the UK, directors and coaches were telling their girls to go and leave a positive review. They were basically marshalling their force and say, go leave a review, flood this thing with positive reviews. And you see that with like Pageant Planet voting and things like that. Which, look, I've interviewed the founder of the Pageant Planet. I think he's a great guy, but I don't like this whole pay for voting thing. Where best coach really isn't best coach. It's just a popularity contest because the coaches are forcing all their clients to go out and vote. I always think like if you want to vote for me, but I'm not going to force you to. And so for many of those reasons, the whole pageant review site just never eventuated. I tried for a short while to combine entrepreneurship with pageantry because I still think there's a big crossover between pageantry and entrepreneurship. I think a lot of you want to start your own business. That never really gained traction either, for one reason or another. Maybe it will sometime, you know, I might try it again later. But what I've really turned my, and this is kind of stage three recently, is really focusing more on the US. And I say this because it's kind of full circle. I never thought I would know enough or be enough, frankly, to go into the US and try and make a name for myself because America for me has always been the mecca of pageantry. Even the little that I know was that if there's one place where I want to try and make it, it's going to be in America, in pageantry at least, and specifically the southern parts of America, because that's where pageantry is biggest. At least that's my understanding. And it was interesting because I started interviewing more American pageant girls, pageant contestants, title holders, and some of the, I'm not going to say my favorite interviews, but the people that because I interview a lot of people, doesn't mean I get along with them in person or I keep in touch with them. But the ones that I felt I had the most in common with, and the ones that I continued to correspond with as friends, not just as an interview, but as a genuine friendship, tended to be, I started noticing they were coming more and more from the southern parts of the states: South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida. And so I've gone to the point now, especially recently, because I did take a bit of a sabbatical. It's probably, well, not a bit, probably for about a year where I didn't really do much in the way of interviewing. Like, I think it was last year, probably 2023, 2022. Like, during that period, I did very few interviews and did a few posts here and there, but I was just jaded because of everything that had happened back in the UK, and getting to see all the sort of the seedy underbelly left me jaded, and I didn't want that attitude to affect people coming into the industry. But I think the beauty of what's sort of come around in this third stage and really focusing, sure, I've still interviewed Australian and UK based queens, but really looking more at the US, specifically the southern states. And this really happened quite recently with interviewing Berkeley Bryant, who's Miss Volunteer America, and then interviewing Christine Williamson, who was Miss Tennessee, Miss Volunteer America, Miss Volunteer Tennessee, America's Ideal Miss, now works with the Miss Volunteer America system, and happened to be based in Tennessee. And a lot of the things in Tennessee I see. First off, a lot of people from there, people like, I've interviewed Presley Pedigo, I've interviewed Taylor Parsons, I've interviewed Bailey Guy. And a lot of those women, I have a lot in common with. I could have a good conversation with, whether it's pageantry or not. Um, I should say I got into Berkeley through Haley Hurst, who was originally I knew her through being Miss Teen Oklahoma USA, and so I started to realize there are certain people that I seem to have a good rapport with, have a fair bit in common with, and if I'm going to keep going, I want to see if I can build. I want to grow. No one wants to just be stagnant. Certainly not me. And so I thought, okay, the next stage is going to be sort of breaking into America and trying to start something up there that's not just an interview thing, but actually like a genuine pageant brand. And if you're going to do that anywhere, I'm going to do that in America, in the southern, in the south somewhere. So I decided I was going to, and plans are in the works, to go and visit Miss Volunteer America, volunteer at Miss Volunteer America in June of 2025 in Tennessee. Apparently, Miss Tennessee itself might be on at the same time, and so I'll see if I can fit that in. There may be other pageants around, and I'll see if I can fit those in. There's more than a few people that I want to catch up with or just meet in person for the first time, whilst I'm over there as well, because I've interviewed hundreds of people and many of them I haven't met in person. But you have conversations with them behind the scenes every day, and it's like I feel like I know this person, but I've never actually seen them. And so that's really been stage three, which has only happened probably the last couple of months or so. Is Okay, we've had our sort of sabbatical, and I don't just want to keep doing things as per usual, because that's stagnant. Number one. Number two, and this is kind of a hard truth, the interview stuff has sort of not just reached its limit. It's not reached the peak of the hill. It's actually now on its decline. And I say that because I've always been interested in people's stories. That's why I love interviewing. But the viewership numbers, they don't lie, and people simply aren't as interested in interviews as I'd like to think they were. Um, and so I need to look at, okay, if I'm going to, well, how am I going to pivot? I need to pivot basically if I'm going to stay in the business. Otherwise, I'll be spending all this time. Yes, and this is the difficulty. Like, I don't think I will keep interviewing, not a lot anyway, because the viewership numbers and so the business simply isn't there. But on the at the same time, I've met the most amazing people and made my pageant friends through interviewing. So it's a bit of a catch 22 situation. But I feel like the next stage is to pivot more into coaching, more into pageant education, and then probably beyond that into maybe general life coaching. But in terms of pageantry, I really need to go and visit the States, sort of the birthplace of pageantry or the heart of pageantry, and find out what the culture there is like. Because I can't hope to break into that arena without understanding it. Um, and so I've spent, 8 years sort of honing my craft. I feel like I'm ready and excited to get into America, see what it's like, see how it's different, get around people who take pageantry seriously, so to speak, because it is an opportunity in America in a way that it's not in the UK or Australia. Particularly, I'm really fascinated with the scholarship opportunities, like in order to get an education, because that's a very real reward. And so those are kind of the three stages. So it was Australia first, then it was the UK, and now, coming full circle, looking at the US. I'm excited for that. I don't know how much more interviewing I'll be doing because, as I said, as much as I enjoy it, I don't think the viewership numbers are there. And I say this as probably someone who would be the foremost authority on that because I've done so many interviews. I can tell you what the numbers are like, and they haven't been on the way up. Let's just put it that way over the years. So it's a moment of change. I'm looking to pivot. I'm setting my sights on America and collaborating with a couple of my American friends. I'm still grateful for the people I've met in Australia and the UK. Some of my best friends are there. And so all this to say that's how I got into pageantry when people ask. So I think that's enough from me. I think it's been a pretty comprehensive look as to who I am, perhaps on a more personal level than I've revealed before, how I got into pageantry to begin with, what my pageant journey has been like, why people come to me for advice. It's because I've been through the ringer. I've pretty much seen everything there is in pageantry. And so now it's like, okay, what should we do next? Because we want to grow, we want to change. Pageantry is evolving. It's different to what it was 8 years ago when I started. Some of it for better, some of it not for better. But we'll see. It's an exciting time, and it's probably the first time in a while that I've been excited about pageantry because I'm looking at it through a different lens now, through a lens more of like a brand, a business, not just an interview show. So we'll see what happens. If you've made it to the end of this, I appreciate you. If you have any questions or any comments, if you're watching on YouTube, leave it below. If you're listening to this or watching this on Spotify, then you can also leave a comment there, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.